Hello fellow crafters, welcome to Home Buddy. My name's Avery and I don't know where to start. About 3 months ago, I was blanching hazelnuts for some cookies and I couldn't help but notice that the water was incredibly pigmented. It was this deep purplish brown that was just really pretty. And a thought came to my mind of, I wonder if anybody's ever used hazelnut skins as a natural dye. It was just making this really beautiful color in the water, and I really wanted to see if I could actually get that onto a fabric. The internet didn't actually have a lot of information regarding this, but I did find this one research article that was behind a paywall where someone actually did use hazelnut skins and hulls in order to dye fabric as kind of an experiment to see what you could do with the byproducts of hazelnut farming. And while I couldn't actually access the article, I was able to read the abstract, which did let me know that the scientist who was doing the experiment used a mordant. Now, I'm still a little foggy on what a mordant actually is, but essentially it's a way of chemically preparing your fabric so that it will accept dye and absorb it rather than just washing out. I ended up finding a great website called Botanical Colors, which was invaluable to this whole process. They are a great starting point if you happen to be interested in the natural dyeing process, since not only do they sell raw materials on their site, they also give plenty of detailed instructions for what measurements to use, as well as tips and tricks to get the deepest color possible. I decided to use aluminum acetate because that was one of the mordants that was mentioned in the abstract for the study. Aluminum acetate is also the preferred mordant for any sort of cotton dyeing. Generally, natural fibers and animal fibers are going to kind of work better with different mordants, and aluminum acetate, that was the one that's recommended for cotton, and since I'm using 100% plain cotton bedsheet to do the dyeing process, it just made the most sense. So I bought 250 grams of aluminum acetate, the same amount of calcium carbonate, and a 5-pound bag of shell-on hazelnuts for the actual dye. Now let's mordant. I'm going to be mordanting this thrifted bedsheet weighing approximately 777 grams. For aluminum acetate, you'll want to use between 5 and 10% of the weight of the fiber. So I measured out 54 grams of aluminum acetate, which is approximately 7% of the weight of the fiber, and stirred in roughly 1 cup of lukewarm water. You'll want to wear personal protection for this because aluminum acetate is actually pretty irritating. I made do with what I had on hand, but I highly recommend wearing eye protection because the powder will explode up into your face the moment you begin stirring, and trust me, that is not a pleasant experience. Once all the lumps were gone, I filled up the largest pot in my kitchen with warm tap water that was about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. I stirred in the aluminum acetate solution and dropped in my fabric, making sure to give it a good stir so that it would be completely saturated. Then I let it sit, rotating it occasionally for 45 minutes before wringing it out. I ended up recharging the bath with even more aluminum acetate so I could prep an extra bedsheet just in case. The next step was to soak the treated fabric in calcium carbonate. I washed out my pot and refilled it with warm water before placing it on the stove to heat. I decided to do one big bath for both pieces of fabric, so I measured out 5% of the total weight of my fiber in calcium carbonate before adding it to my boiling pot along with the fabric and allowing everything to stay submerged for 30 minutes before giving it a thorough rinse. I generally don't recommend hang drying your fabric when it's actively raining, but I didn't really have a choice, and I did see a rainbow afterwards, so that was pretty cool. And while the fabric dried, I could start working on the hazelnuts. To start the dye, I began cracking open my hazelnuts as quickly as possible, which took about 45 minutes with a manual nutcracker. I did my best to save as much of the shell bits as possible, but I did lose some product due to user error. Once I had everything cracked and sorted, it was time to separate the hazelnut skins from the nuts, and that's where the difficulty started. I ran into some trouble actually removing the skins from the hazelnuts. Normally when I'm removing skins from hazelnuts, I like to use the blanching method where you basically just boil a bunch of water, pour in some baking soda, and the alkalized water will basically kind of remove the skins really easily, and then you dump it in the cold water, it'll shock the skins off, you can rub it between a towel with your hands, and it'll just slip right off. However, I was worried about how the baking soda would interact with the mordant when it came to the dyeing process, and I was worried it would make things more ineffectual. So instead, I decided to try the toasting method where you put all the hazelnuts out on one big cookie sheet and you bake them at like 425 for like 15 minutes and then you rub them off. But unfortunately, that just didn't really work very well. I still had a lot of skin on the hazelnuts, and since I didn't want to have a bunch of waste, the whole point of this is that it would be a byproduct of the food and that you weren't going to be like wasting food in order to make the dye. I ended up blanching the rest and discarding all of the skins that I couldn't just get off by using the toasting method. So I only ended up with a small amount of skins, which caused some problems later, but I'll get into that in a bit. Originally, when I started this experiment, I really wanted to do 3 different pots of dye. I wanted to do one that was entirely hazelnut skins, another one that was half hazelnut hulls and half hazelnut skins, and another one that was just hazelnut hulls. Unfortunately, because I had to use the blanching process, I was left with a lot less hazelnut skins than I'd hoped for, so ultimately I decided to just do one big dye pot in the hopes of just getting as much pigment as possible. Now, for the actual extraction process, I didn't have any instructions, so I went with the old tried and true method of throwing everything in a pot with water and just boiling the crap out of it. Essentially, I left everything on a low simmer, stirring and topping off the pot with water whenever it was needed for about 4 days. In retrospect, I did not need to do this. I should have just boiled it for about an hour, and that's probably as much color as I was gonna get, but I was just really desperate for it to get a deeper color, so I just kept going for like 4 days until eventually I just kind of gave up. At which point I cut the heat and waited for everything to cool before straining out the liquid through a cheesecloth. And I was left with dye the color of a weak black tea that was admittedly quite interesting, but again was nowhere near the same vibrancy as that deep purple brown that kind of brought me to this experiment in the first place. So that was admittedly a little disappointing. The dyeing process itself was actually pretty easy. I basically just took my dye pot, added enough water so that the fabric could easily move around, and slowly heated it to a simmer, and then kind of let it simmer for about 30 to 40 minutes, and just stirring it continuously so that every little bit got incorporated into the mixture. I then cut the heat and left the cloth to soak overnight in the mixture in the hopes of getting a deeper color. However, by the next morning, it was pretty clear that the color wasn't going to get any darker than it already was, so I rinsed off the fabric and left it to air dry outside. At this point, I was pretty dissatisfied with how my hazelnut dye had turned out, so I tried to troubleshoot for better results with my other piece of fabric, and I thought that if I tried to dye a smaller piece of fabric and didn't have to dilute the dye bath with extra water, I might get a darker hue. So I cut off a smaller piece of the other mordanted bedsheet and boiled down my dye bath until it was highly concentrated before trying the process over again. And unfortunately, the results were still less than impressive. It is a slightly different color from the original, but I'm pretty sure that's just because this bedsheet was originally cream, where the first bedsheet was a stark white. But at this point I was kind of feeling a little bit like a failure and pretty discouraged about the whole home dyeing thing, and I wanted to see if there was anything just in my immediate vicinity that I could just throw in a pot that could potentially, you know, give me a little bit more of a reaction than just like slightly of a darker shade of, you know, nude. And luckily, one of the prickly pear cactuses in my parents' backyard had a cochineal infestation, so I quickly went out to harvest some. If you're wondering what the heck I'm talking about, cochineal bugs are a type of scale insect that feed off of certain cactuses, and they're a primary ingredient in carmine dye. These little white spots on the cactus contain cochineal bugs that feed on the cactus and when crushed release a bright red pigment. This is an ancient natural dye that was used by Aztec and Maya peoples as early as 2nd century BC, and is still a huge economic export of South America. It takes roughly 7,000 cochineal bugs to make 1 pound of commercial dye, but I only harvested what I could, which amounted to about a teaspoon of actual material. Content warning, I killed some bugs. It's nothing, you know, horribly overt, but just be aware. Traditionally, you dry out the cochineal first before crushing and adding it to the water, but I didn't have time for that, so I just threw everything in a pot with some water and brought it to simmer on the stove. After 30 minutes, I strained out and crushed the raw material before adding it back into the pot with more water and 1/8 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, which supposedly helps the color go from a more purple shade to a brighter red. I left it to simmer for another 30 minutes before straining the result. Now, to use the cochineal dye, I cut a small portion of my mordanted fiber and added it to my dye pot along with the dye and some warm water. Then I let it sit at room temperature for 30 minutes before bringing the contents of the pot to a simmer and keeping it there for another 40 minutes before taking it out to dry. And I have to say, the difference in vibrancy is immediately obvious.
especially when you consider the amount of raw materials I used to make the hazelnut dye versus what I used for the cochineal. It is a little patchy in places where I wonder if I didn't agitate the pot properly or if the mordant was uneven, but I'm fairly pleased with how the experiment turned out.
So there you have it. That's kind of how I tried dyeing with hazelnuts and also cochineal insects and what I learned from the experience. It's definitely something I might want to try again. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do exactly this, but natural dyes are really cool and I would really like to experiment more with them. So if that's something you'd be interested in seeing, please let me know in the comments below. So I do have to figure out what to do with all this dyed fabric. I'm not really sure what to do with it because it didn't turn out as dark as I'd hoped. And so it's not exactly a super flattering shade for my skin tone, but you know, it's cotton, so we'll figure something out. Let me know if you have any ideas for that too. Again, thanks so much for watching, you guys. If you like this video, please be sure to like this video and subscribe for even more crafty content. I think my next video is probably gonna be another sewing video, so keep your eyes out for that and hit the little notification bell if you haven't already. Goodbye!